Welcome back to the Wallace branch. Today, this is not going to be a build video, but instead I'm going to take you on a partial run-through or route tour of the map. And we're starting, as already shown, in DeBorgia, Montana, which is a small town on the eastern side of the route. The tracks are really coming from Missoula to the east. There's not, in reality, any kind of staging yard or anything to really signify the beginning of the route. This is really the middle of the Northern Pacific's Wallace branch and the Milwaukee Road main line. This section of the route has catenaries because this was shared track for much of the later parts of its existence when the NP was using Milwaukee tracks. There's not a lot to see in this video other than what we're watching right here on screen, and I deliberately did not add any placeholders or major building assets because I wanted to be able to show them as I was placing them in order to give you the feeling like you're really following along on the building of the route. And for this tour, I am really copying Approach Medium's Pennsylvania and Berwind route, where he showed a complete run-through of the right-of-way at a couple of different phases. One was fairly early on in his build, and another was maybe closer to completion. And so I'm planning to do that as well. And this video today, this can serve as the baseline for that later comparison video. But for now, it's a good place for us to showcase the Tranz map and the track layout that we just completed. At Haugen, I just roughed in the Y tracks and a few other tracks. This is not intended as the final layout. Later, much later, I compared with the Drexel and Avery route of Toomey or Trainz, as well as with the Milwaukee track profile and the USGS maps. So this is where the Milwaukee and NP Wallace branch separated, and we're at around milepost 2 of this route, and that equates to roughly milepost 89 on the real Wallace branch. There's going to be a long stretch of mostly empty terrain coming up, although I do plan to add some fictional industry to each of the towns along the route. I decided to leave most of the long stretches, which is basically the prototype. Wiley's is marked as a waypoint along the Wallace branch in the NP valuation map that I have, but the 1900 timetable does not indicate any kind of spur or siding here. Nevertheless, I felt that a small siding would be useful, and if you have any resources with a complete NP track profile or any kind of list of sidings from sometime later, like 1950 or 1930s, that would be really useful for me to compare, even though I'm not necessarily planning or promising to follow the prototype like 100%. Nine miles into the route, or Northern Pacific milepost 95, we reach Saltese, which is just beyond the bend in the river here, and it's also the location of an interesting steel bridge on the Milwaukee side. I felt that a tunnel would be nice here, even though I don't believe one existed in reality. I am open to changing that in the future, but for now I think it's a nice little break in the scenery. After Saltese, we have another 5-mile stretch without much interest. But on today's interstate, this area is just long stretches of steep forested mountains, and the only thing really of note is the Milwaukee right-of-way climbing the hillside to the left on the south side of the river, which now is a bike path. Although I'm not clear if that specific part here is actually part of the Trail of the Hiawatha, but a lot of that trail is bike path and hiking path. we're coming up to another point of interest, which is the town of Taft, or ghost town maybe, non-existent town, no longer extant town. There's not much here, not today, and even not originally. Actually, according to the roadside historical markers, Taft was basically a temporary town that housed those working on the tunnel on the St. Paul Pass, and the town burned down twice, and almost nothing was left, basically shortly after it was built. The one remaining building was torn down for the interstate. Taft is marked on the Northern Pacific valuation map and the 1900 timetable, but those don't mention or show any siding or spur tracks, and the same thing for USGS maps. By the way, it is named for President Taft, or actually, he was war secretary at the time when he stopped by, and according to Wikipedia, he berated the town as a blight on the American landscape, which must clean up its act. And he said this to a cheering, drunken crowd, and subsequently, the town was then enthusiastically named in his honor. Ahead, you can see a peak at the edge of the map where there's a sharp cliff, and you can see the gray or tan underground cutaway in the terrain. I will obviously hide that and other such cliffs to the extent possible, but it's not always possible in this type of terrain. And I do want to say I prefer the cutaway, which shows the terrain and color underneath. I prefer that to the HD terrain where there's nothing underneath there, no texture. And so basically you just see this huge, bright, white glare instead of something reasonably dark in color that can be kind of covered up a little bit. I don't know why that had to change for HD terrain. I think that the original way was much better. Now we're climbing up towards Lookout Pass, and this is a very tight and rugged stretch of curves. In real life, it included a tunnel, a bridge, the creek in the bottom there, and all of that I think would be very hard to model without HD terrain. And actually, I'd say it isn't even that easy to model with HD terrain. Making a model railroad, this is the type of terrain that might look a little bit too crowded to be actually realistic, but it is realistic. That's what really existed. One issue I'll mention again is that with HD terrain, this type of steep terrain tends to visibly move as you approach each slope. And I consider that as a pretty substantial flaw in the HD terrain system, at least the way it's been implemented. And it's just not visible in this version that we're looking at because it's not yet converted to HD, so you can't see that moving terrain aspect. After the Borax Tunnel, we have another fairly long stretch of empty track. Really not many sidings along the Wallace branch up to Lookout. Nothing basically between Saltese and Sohon, which is just an escape track near Lookout Pass. Initially, I wanted Sohon as a siding, but I decided to make it more accurate as a spur track later on. Now we are coming up to Lookout Pass. The original highway mostly followed the railroad right-of-way. There is a ski area at Lookout Pass, historic ski area, and the mountain that it's on, interestingly, is called Runt Mountain. The mountain pass, Lookout Pass, that separates the watershed of the St. Regis River, which flows into the Clark Fork and then the Flathead, from the watershed of the Coeur d'Alene. But both ultimately flow into the Pacific. Pass, by the way, is at milepost 110 on the Northern Pacific, which is 23 miles into this route. Now we're entering some very steep downgrades as the right-of-way heads down into the valley. Initially, I felt many of the tightest curves over the small mountain creeks would have been crossed by short trestles or bridges, so I did put in some placeholders here, and then quickly I decided to take them out again. I would like to see a track profile that would really indicate what existed at some point in the past, maybe 1930 ideally, or 1950. I believe that the Northern Pacific Railroad Historical Association has one from 1928, but I don't have access to that. Milepost 113, we arrive at Dorsey, which is a siding right by the famous S-curve trestle, and here the track doubles back on itself and continues down in elevation. Again, I inserted a few bridges here for interest, but I don't think they existed in reality, and I think I just took them out. Here again, the track loops around, and finally we have some potential site of interest along the trackside, which is namely the Hale Fish Hatchery, which is at Pottsville, and that still exists. It does go back 100 years or so, and I envision a spur track and the opportunity to maybe spot a couple carloads of salmon here. Although I have to say it could be tough given that there are no sidings immediately nearby, so I don't know how to actually get those cars. Maybe have to bring them all the way back to Mullen or something to put them together into a train. Larson is the next point of interest. There really was a siding here, although I don't know if there was any industry. Today, that area does have a lot of tailings ponds, but I don't plan to include those tailings piles and tailings ponds right away. Maybe I could add them later. I don't know. But what I envision here is maybe sort of like a gravel industry. Now, just not too far after Larson, we come to milepost 121, which is starting to get into the town of Mullen, and we have some real industry to service, and the first of which is the Spindley Gold Hunter Mine. And that's now occupied, by the way, by the modern Hecla-owned Lucky Friday Mine. The NP did have a couple tracks here, and the line passed right under some sort of drainage pipes for this structure. Next is the actual town of Mullen, which is fairly substantial, and it has some restaurants and old brick buildings to model. I do have a few different track plans from the Sandburn maps for this area, although not a complete plan and definitely not very many photos of the railroad. Then the line curves around a bend in the river, and it begins to parallel the Union Pacific, which is the third major railroad of this route. And at one point, the NP tracks, I believe, were abandoned, and the two railroads shared tracks. Not sure whether it was the UP or the NP that was abandoned. Next, around the curve, we come to this huge Morning Mine complex, and that was served by a bunch of spur tracks from the NP, according to the Sandburn maps. And then, unfortunately, after that, we come to a long stretch with little interest. Definitely a good place for putting the train on some sort of AI control. There was a sighting at Grouse, milepost 124 on the NP, which is 38 miles into this tour, more than halfway to the end. Now we're coming to the heart of the route and the intersection with the two branch lines to Burke. Burke was served by both the UP and the NP, with tracks running right up the main street. We just passed directly into the broad, flat valley of Wallace. The placeholder tracks here will be redone completely. Here's where the line passes through the center of town. There's the historic chalet-style Wallace Depot, and that will be the subject of the next episode in this series. And of course, there's nothing for us to look at right now, except we're getting familiar with the empty, green terrain. And this is where the NP right-of-way peters out, although the NP, I believe, did use the UP track rights to service some industries down to Kellogg, I think. Just 2 miles west of Wallace is the little town of Silverton, I plan to add a fictional industry here. I don't have any UP track profile or anything to base Silverton or the nearby Osborne on. So if somebody does have those and passes them along, I'd certainly appreciate that, although I have a mind to create more a fictional type of route in that area where I don't have any resources. Now we're another 2 miles west, which is roughly UP milepost number 76. We've reached Osborne, which covers a pretty substantial portion of this valley. And again, here in Osborne, I do plan a fictional industry to add some interest, and which will be a concrete transloading operation. After Osborne, sad to say, there's another fairly long stretch of empty terrain to Kellogg. And that's the obvious downside to a large transstem route. The real world is either too complex or too simple for the ideal level of interest for operating a route. But I decided to keep this prototypical for the most part because, it does give you an idea of scale, and sometimes it's nice to have empty terrain because you put the train on AI control and go do something else. "53 miles into the route, we've reached Kellogg. By the way, less than 10 miles from the end of this route. We're at UP milepost 70 or so. I placed a few dead trees on the hillside because I was having a tough time navigating the area, otherwise seeing where these places were. Heading west, we first come through the small downtown, and then we come up to the Bunker Hill and Sullivan concentrator, which was a huge complex of wooden structures, narrow gauge trestles, and lots of railroad tracks. I don't have a full track profile, but the Sanborn maps cover this whole stretch fairly well. After a bit of terrain that's pretty empty, we come up to the area of the huge smelter complex. And again, I marked that by a dead tree. A spur track will curve up the mountain valley to the left here, and that will service the zinc plant, which was up that valley. And both the smelter and the zinc plant, they had huge smokestacks in their later years, and those smokestacks were monuments for the whole area. And I felt like if I have to create any assets for this region, those would definitely have to be there, or else, there's no point. Right around the bend is the town of Smelterville. Now, the smelter is gone, but Smelterville remains. I am not planning any industry for that area because it's right by the smelter anyway. Now we have another long stretch without a lot of interest. The right-of-way passes alongside the county airport runway, but I do plan to include that. I have marked this as Pinehurst, although in reality Pinehurst is a bit to the southwest. The right-of-way here curves to the right. And Cataldo is a little bit further on, but I'm planning to put Cataldo here, along with a fictional arm of Lake Coeur d'Alene, where I can have some steamboats. And that's where we wrap up. I hope you've enjoyed the tour, and thanks for staying with me. I hope you'll come back again next time, and in the meantime, you might as well give me a like if you're interested in seeing more. Thanks for watching, and see you next time on the Wallace Branch.